message for you to help you get settled in on your first night.
Welcome to the series saga, where we discuss the distinctive features, evolution, and impact of our favorite video game franchises. I'm your host, Gorgini the Meanie, and on today's episode, we'll be taking an extended shift at Five Nights at Freddy's, an indie series made by Scott Cawthon. You know, out of all the games to form a cult following, FNAF honestly fits the profile. It became popular at an absurd rate, and stayed that way too. So much so that there's now a movie based on the games, and as with all video game movies, it was okay. Five Nights at Freddy's is known for its in-depth lore and simple yet clever use of tools and strategy to survive the night, by fending off the eerie animatronics.
I think I peed a little bit.
If you somehow haven't played the games before, you certainly know about them. A classic experience involves flicking through cameras at a rapid pace, monitoring the doors or vents, finding the most obscure Easter eggs for some random piece of lore, and of course, plenty of jump scares. As the games progressed, the mechanics became more complex, but the foundation was quite an ingenious concept. It made for great entertainment for people to play and to watch. Over the course of an entire month, I played through all the mainline games, from the original all the way to Security Breach. Now, because they're considered spin-offs, I will not be covering the Help Wanted and Custom Night games. With that, I think it's about time we start our shift together, so buckle up as we dive deep into Five Nights at Freddy's. And of course, I hope you enjoy. What do you know of Chipper & Sons Lumber Company? Probably not much. Scott Cawthon created this game in 2013, a free-to-play experience where you chop wood and do other activities for Chipper, your abusive father.
I miss my dad.
Scott Cawthon received criticism for the game because, unintentionally, the characters moved in a disturbing animatronic-like way. My only criticism is that there is no Elden Ring level boss at the end of it. So, Scott decided to purposely make a horror game with these animatronic behaviors in mind, and that's how FNAF was born. One of Scott Cawthon's greatest qualities as a developer is that he takes feedback seriously. What you'll notice is that with most of his games, Scott will improve the main issue the previous installment had. After the first few games, Five Nights at Freddy's left quite an impact on the indie horror genre and the community. Multiple Reddit threads arguing over the lore, numerous animations, and of course, fan-made game ripoffs.
If we go down the list here, we got Five Nights at Floppa, such a classic. We got Five Nights at Stalin, Five Nights at Furries. We got Five Nights at Tinky, Smog, Sexies. Ooh. Oh, there's Floppa Zero, the sequel. You got, really? Skibidi Toilet?
You know, a series has made an impression when other people attempt to copy the formula or create their own twist on it. We've seen it before with games like Dark Souls or Monster Hunter. But what really made these games well known was a bunch of big YouTubers playing the first game at the time, back in 2014. I was 14 back then, and I think it's crazy how long this series has been able to keep on kicking. My question is, why Five Nights at Freddy's? What is it about this series that made it so popular and kept it going? Firstly, I think it's the lore. With how deep this trench goes, no wonder there are dozens of videos about the timeline, Easter eggs, or story of a specific game.
Yes, thank you, Malwarebytes, appreciate it.
This series is so lore-heavy that even the release dates were being theorized as a part of some hidden meaning. The games don't spoon-feed you the lore, it's your job to discover it, which makes it all the more impactful when you do find it. Games like Dark Souls are so fascinating and have such a loyal fan base because discovering the story and lore is a large part of the experience. FNAF is no different here. On my way back home from college, I listened to an 8-hour long video about the complete lore of Five Nights at Freddy's. I'm still recovering. Secondly, it's because FNAF redirected horror in a different direction. The horror genre is saturated with repetitive themes like aliens, zombies, or demons, for example, which is fine, but you don't see much horror with animatronics or characters that were meant for children that then become these monstrosities. Don't get me wrong, there are horror movies like Willy's Wonderland or Banana Splits that participated in this niche subgenre, but it was FNAF that became the first major gaming title that sparked this interest nobody else entertained. In addition to that, I think FNAF takes some characterization of analog horror. I and many other people find analog horror to not only be truly terrifying, but insanely intriguing. FNAF has some of these attributes, such as the grainy cameras, the oblique shadows, and subtle messaging. It creates a phenomenal horror experience that I think made FNAF stick out at the time. Five Nights at Freddy's is a simple game by gameplay standards. Survive from 12 AM to 6 AM for 5 nights from Freddy and the gang by using some common elements. The cameras, the lights, the doors, and the vents. Each night spikes in difficulty, but if you really hate yourself, there's 2020 mode. For people who want Dark Souls difficulty in the form of haunted furries, there you go. This is the core design of Five Nights at Freddy's and how the gameplay reflects the identity of this series. Some titles don't exactly follow that route, but their differences certainly have their own charm, and we'll get to that. Now, in terms of ranking and comparing the games to one another, it's best to talk about the 3 major categories that makes Five Nights at Freddy's. The gameplay. It's obviously an important part to any game. Because these are classified as horror games, the horror factor is another category. And finally, the lore. Now, if you think I'm going to discuss all the secrets and lore that this series has, you're insane. So I won't talk about the lore specifically in detail, but what I will mention is how the game handles its own story and expresses its own lore in the overall narrative. When it comes to discussing an entire series, it's best to begin with the first game and see what changed or improved with the later installments. Let's start with the foundation and see how the series developed from there.
Hello? Hello? I wanted to record a message for you to help you get settled in on your first night.
Five Nights at Freddy's 1. This is it, folks. This is where the dream began. The game begins with a newspaper article about your new job at Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria. Shortly after, you're in the game and greeted with an absolute banger of a soundtrack. In all seriousness, FNAF 1 is immediately unsettling. There's no long intro cinematic to immerse you into the world like Silent Hill or Resident Evil. You're simply dropped into the first night without a clue on what to do. You're stuck inside a claustrophobic office with 2 open doors, a set of cameras, and limited power. As you turn on the cameras, you're greeted by the main cast, Bonnie, Chica, and Freddy, with Foxy being introduced in later nights. FNAF is one of those games where the more you discover, the more unsettling the whole atmosphere becomes. The cast is sitting quietly on their show stage, but, I mean, come on, this is a horror game. You know that they're gonna move eventually. Their designs are uncanny, giving human-like qualities to things that shouldn't have them. When it comes to the gameplay, you don't feel that much safer. Your controls consist of flicking through cameras, checking the lights, closing doors, and sweating profusely in the armpit area. It may seem weird for the security office to have multiple defense mechanisms, but that's because the animatronics
Do get a bit quirky at night.
For 5 nights, you were defending yourself from the main cast from fondling your body into a suit. It seems pretty easy, except the building is powered by 2 AA batteries. As you complete each night, not only do the animatronics become more active, but the power drains faster. The first game leans heavily on the limited electricity mechanic. All 3 actions use up power, and the longer you use them, the less juice you have. Each game is designed with different mechanics and animatronics that the player has to master in order to survive. For FNAF 1, it's really not the cast that's an issue, it's the power.
Well, it was fun while it lasted.
I don't know if there's a grandma running on some wheel in the basement filled with still water, but I blink for 1 second and the power is already down by 20%. The electricity in FNAF 1 is meant to limit your usage of tools, otherwise there's no danger. And this rings true for the games that follow this formula. There's a threat, there's a way to defend yourself, and then there's a mechanic in place that regulates your way of defense. I think FNAF 1 relies too much on limited power as a way to balance the game, because once night 4 or 5 hits, really the biggest jump scare is seeing that bar hit 10%. It's a bit tedious, but the fact that this game is at most 2 hours, I'm willing to let this go, because by the time it gets repetitive, you're on night 5. Regardless, this doesn't mean Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Freddy are not a problem. They have their own patterns that you need to understand. What you notice is that each game has a strategy in order to juggle all these things, by minimizing your usage of power and finding the most effective way to keep track of all the animatronics. Now, am I a master of all of these strategies? No, I didn't look up a guide, and I don't really care that much either. But I'm simply just going to tell you what I did for each game. Fortunately for the first one, it's a simple strategy. Rule number 1, forget about Bonnie and Chica. Their purpose is to initiate the first jump scare, make you give that 5-star rating, and then afterwards to waste power. The lights in the game are used for only these two, so a routine flick of the lights on both sides of the door will be enough. If you see them at the door, close it. You don't want to waste time pinpointing their exact location, as it really doesn't matter until they reach your door. Again, just flick the lights periodically, you'll be fine. Rule number 2 is a rule that will follow us throughout half of these games. Foxy is very foxy. And I mean foxy as in cunning or sly, not sexy. I'm not a furry. Now, the way Foxy works is you have to keep the camera on. It doesn't have to be his camera specifically. If you keep the camera down for too long, Foxy will enter your office like a neglectful mother who forgot she had a child. It doesn't take much, just flick the camera on, check on him, and then flick it back down. As long as he's there, you're fine, but once you see that stage is empty, pucker your butthole, because he's coming for you. Now, you can prevent certain death by triggering his running animation, switching to this camera, and then quickly closing the door after. Once all the knocks have stopped, you're safe with Foxy being back on the stage. Rule number 3. Freddy doesn't really play by the rules. Freddy is like Bonnie and Chica. He has a generated path like the rest, except he does not move backwards. He will keep advancing throughout the night until he gets to the final camera. If you see Freddy at the final cam, it's best to keep your door shut and pray you have enough power to wait it out. For Freddy, it's similar to Foxy, except you have to keep the camera on him. Doing so will essentially freeze him in place. The point of your camera in later nights is specifically for Freddy and Foxy. Each animatronic has a certain pattern and an additional mechanic to keep track of. Now, the strategy I used for FNAF 1 was to check on Foxy, check Freddy, check both lights, rinse and repeat. It's that simple. The great people of Reddit have mentioned to me that Freddy obeys these rules even on the show stage camera, which I didn't know about. So I decided to test that strategy myself. Turns out they were not lying. By following this plan, he did not move at all until 4 AM. By then, he didn't have enough time to reach me before 6, but I died to Chica, so it didn't even matter. What I find interesting is that FNAF starts as a horror game, but quickly becomes this challenge of juggling everything at once. You get used to the scariness of a game once you've played it enough, but FNAF replaces that horror with a neat challenge, which I think is a great way to keep people entertained. Regardless, the first game left quite an impact with its atmosphere. The subtle or not so subtle changes in the pizzeria just intensify the horror to an insane degree. Whether it may be the exoskeletons facing the camera, or Golden Freddy appearing in your office, every game has these Easter eggs, but I find FNAF 1 to be the best at it. Some of these future games are more linear in their shock value, such as Security Breach, so finding these subtle details or movements in the shadows is a scripted part of the game. Once you walk past a dark hallway, it triggers a cutscene or something runs by in the middle of the night. When you find these Easter eggs in FNAF 1, it's at random, it's a natural occurrence. So when you do notice them, it catches you completely off guard. Other Easter eggs focus on revealing more of the story, while in the first game, it does do that, but it really enhances the experience for the most part. Perspective is also, I think, an underrated part of a horror game that nobody really talks about. See, FNAF 1 has these sharp, warped views from the cameras that make the cast look somewhat ghostly or distorted. Chica near the bathrooms is my prime example because the way she looks up at the camera, her exposed exoskeleton underneath, it is a terrifying point of view that makes her seem so much more scary than from any other angle. Freddy hides in the shadows and you can only see his eyes. Bonnie will do the same, or sometimes he'll stare directly into the camera. It's these different perspectives that give life to the horror. Another aspect is the audio. This game has no music, your only ambiance being the Office fan. However, this is a great setup because when a game as eerily quiet as FNAF 1 is, even the slightest noise, it immediately becomes a problem. Freddy will hum throughout the halls, Chica will cause a racket in the kitchen, even some cheery music will play from across the restaurant. This is such a great defined atmosphere, but what happens in some of the future games is this type of audio becomes a part of the game's mechanics. There are certainly good positives to that, and we'll talk about that later, but I prefer them to be strictly world-building tools. This series starts off strong with the first game. It is an instant classic that created a storm of fans, unique ideas, and an intriguing gameplay loop. Every aspect that I've talked about thus far, every other game in the series has to some degree. So now we'll get to see what each game did, for better or for worse. I give the first game a solid 9 on the grading scale. As far as the ranking goes, since we don't have any other games to compare it to yet, I'll just place it in the middle for now. Five Nights at Freddy's 2, released only 3 months after the first game. Scott Cawthon saw his golden goose lay eggs and he did not waste any time raising a second bird. I have what's called a tug-of-war relationship with FNAF 2. On some days I think it's great, on others I think it's mediocre at best. This is because out of the three categories, one is great, the other is good, and the other is not so good. Let's talk about what I think this game struggles with the most, the horror factor. This game's atmosphere is alright, but when compared to the other FNAF games, it just loses every single time. It's hard to improve what the first game did because it was so well done, and you can't really improve analog style horror. Like, what are you gonna do, make the cameras more grainy? All you can really do is change up the style or format. FNAF 3, for example, had a dark greenish tone to its atmosphere, as if the building itself was rusting to the ground. It feels old, decrepit, and abandoned. That's great. FNAF 2 had its own style, but that style was more so built into the animatronics rather than the setting. Besides, the new animatronic designs are garbage when compared to the original. The old Withered cast is great, mind you, but the new toy versions, Mangle and Balloon Boy, are too childish for me to really carry that sense of horror. I think the biggest offender here is your office. In FNAF 1, it was dark, everything was crowded, you felt caged, as if you were prey. In FNAF 2, the office is wide open and not nearly dark enough. There are certainly some creepy segments in this game, like the cutscenes between each night, but within the actual gameplay, the tension only comes from the anticipated jump scares. However, FNAF 2's gameplay was a solid improvement. The second game in the series feels more of the same, but focuses on the animatronics rather than a scarce use of power. You do have a flashlight now, which can die, but FNAF 2's battery is not a means of creating more of a challenge. It's more of a way to prevent overusage. You can use the flashlight to see down the hallway or even on the cameras. Along with your flashlight, you have an empty Freddy mask to hide from the animatronics that enter your office. As for the animatronics, look, there are like 20 of them. I'm not going to break down each one. Let me just give you the basic rundown. The core idea here is that there are 3 ways the animatronics can enter your office: left vent, right vent, and the giant hallway in the center. The main principle here is to put the mask on when you see an animatronic in the vents or in your office. That's pretty much it. The older cast will actually enter your office and the others will appear in the vents. Both are thwarted by putting the mask on. You'll have visual and audible cues indicating that they're gone, and you can continue from there. Some of them have specific rules though. Foxy, much like in FNAF 1, is a different story. If you see him in the hallways, you have to constantly flash your light like you're playing a Mario Party game, and eventually he'll get the idea and leave. But of course, there's the main cornerstone of FNAF 2, the marionette. You must wind up this box throughout the night, and as each night passes, it winds down quicker. You'll get some indication that the box is close to opening, but what makes this difficult is the mask. See, having the mask on makes it wind down quicker, and if you recall, most of the animatronics require the mask down in order to survive. Toy Bonnie is especially annoying because he takes his sweet time before blowing off someplace else. FNAF 2 is arguably the most difficult game of the series because roughly 30 seconds of gameplay looks like this. I agree with this statement because tense is an understatement when I played this game. I felt like at any moment something would catch me off guard and put me back at the title screen. And I do like how busy it is. I actually feel like I'm playing a game again instead of the game playing me out of $5. Now as for a strategy, it's much easier than you think it is. Sometimes you simply get cornered or you have bad luck. It happens, alright? When you have an entire army to keep track of, it happens. But what you want to do is check both vent lights, flash the hallway, wind up the box, rinse and repeat. Much like the first game, it's not about using the camera and the flashlight to pinpoint everybody's location. The camera is really only there for the marionette. However, I do have a certified ya boy tip to aid you on your shift. After each wind up, when putting the camera down, put the mask on immediately. It's a way to make sure that nothing surprises you, because that can certainly happen. The timing for putting the mask on is pretty strict, so if you prematurely put it on, you'll be fine. Just flash it on, nobody there, take it off. Sometimes the old animatronics will forcefully pull down the camera, so getting into that habit of using the mask really does come in handy. At this point in the series, people were already clocking in 9 to 5 trying to piece the story together. FNAF 1 was merely an appetizer to get people hungry for more. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 delivers a full course meal of story content that made people speculate for weeks on end. Again, I'm not going to talk about the lore in detail, but what I do know is FNAF 2 satiated FNAF fans for a good while, at least until the third game came out. While I do have my problems with this game's atmosphere, and as a horror game, it kind of upsets me. But FNAF 2 is a good game that improved the gameplay and offered more to the story. So with that being considered, I'm giving FNAF 2 a 7.5. which of course puts it below the original. Five Nights at Freddy's 3 is arguably the worst game in the series, and it's not hard to see why. Most of my gameplay was deciphering if I was seeing Springtrap or static in the shape of Springtrap. I understand grainy cameras makes the game really scary, but if it inhibits my vision this badly, you can turn down the noise a bit. Otherwise, visually speaking, this game is pretty great. Like I mentioned earlier, I love this rusted, dark color scheme the game has. It makes it feel ancient, as if this place hasn't been in service for a long time. Springtrap is the big boy animatronic in FNAF 3. He is the main reason why this game sucks. Your success is entirely based on if Springtrap wants to cooperate or not, otherwise known as RNG. You have these audio bites that you can play to attract Springtrap to certain places, i.e. away from your office. Sometimes he'll listen to it, other times he has his AirPods in listening to freaking, I don't know, Sleep Token, and ignores the audio entirely. He can enter the vents, which is fine, you can block them off. But if you mess it up, he can instantly teleport straight to your door. If you see this creepy child diddler peeking around the corner, it is an almost guaranteed death. There is no distinct pattern to identify with Springtrap. Yes, you can follow a strategy, which I'll discuss in a moment, but luck is more of a factor than it should be. And let me not forget to mention the Phantom animatronics. These lovely boys and girl will jump scare you inside your office, but won't end the game outright. Throughout the night, while you use your cameras, audio, and ventilation, the system will need a quick reboot. This is the other reason why I dislike this game. Maintaining these three mechanics is pure annoyance, and especially when a phantom scares you in the later nights, there is a good chance you've already planted one foot in the grave. As the week goes on, they become less functional, thus more rebooting is required. It's annoying, and the screen takes your attention for about half of the game. It is a mechanic that forces a pause in the action, more so than in any other game. Really, my only strategy was to keep Springtrap bouncing between the two farthest cameras by using audio cues. Preemptively closing the nearest connected vent to is a smart idea, just in case he tries to go in there, which he will. There is an audible indication when Springtrap enters in or out of the vents. While Springtrap is in there, that would be a really good time to reboot the system, because normally he stays in there for a minute. The Phantoms Freddy, Foxy, Chica, and Balloon Boy are all easy to avoid by ignoring them. Balloon Boy and Chica will appear on specific cameras, and if you see them, you just switch cameras, and that takes care of them. If you're on the camera too much, Foxy will appear in your office. This one is a bit hard to avoid, but if you slowly turn and see him peeking there, turn away and turn back. That usually gets him to leave. Freddy likes to pace outside the window, but if you master the art of not caring and continue to play the game like normal, he's pretty chill. You deliberately have to stare at him in order to induce a jump scare, which, I mean, for a first time playthrough, of course you're gonna stare at it, but once you realize that, it's really not hard to avoid him. It's unfortunate really, because I do like this change of pace that FNAF 3 attempted to do. Focusing on one animatronic while the others assist in getting Springtrap to you is a neat twist on the original concept. I can recognize that. However, the game attempts to balance your tools in an unmannered way that really ruins the flow of the overall game. The Phantoms are also too easy to avoid. I mean, once you figure it out, you pretty much never see them again. It's a shame because, much like the atmosphere, the design of these animatronics are great. Springtrap's design is awesome as well. I mean, he is a serial killer named William Afton who is stuck inside a spring-locked suit. So yeah, FNAF 3 unveils some of the lore's more gruesome details and who is behind most of the evil done in the timeline. Really adds on to the horror value of this game and the overall narrative as well. But how does the game reveal said information? Just give me a second. There. Boom, in the form of secret minigames. I like how Scott's way of delivering lore is always in the form of old arcade-like games. It is such a clever move that thematically works with the series. Not to mention, interacting with the camera in order to discover it is quite creative. It's like everything besides the core gameplay mechanics is good. FNAF 2 had a similar build to FNAF 1, you can't really mess that up, but FNAF 3 tried its own tone, and for that I'll give it some credit. The audio design was reminiscent of the first game, having quiet hums and noises that got your heart racing. All in all though, the RNG was too much, and I hate to do this, but when compared to the other games, I can't give it a higher score than a 5. The gameplay loop does become boring very quickly once you know what to do, and being RNG based was not a good move. This goes without saying, but FNAF 3 is at the bottom, and we can leave some room in between because it's gonna take a while for a really bad game to be the caboose at the end of this ranking. One of the main criticisms Scott received for Five Nights at Freddy's 3 were the jump scares. The phantoms were fine, it's really Springtrap that caused an uproar. He kinda just lazily walks up to you, which, I mean, I get it, he's a corpse stuffed inside a suit. So what does Scott do in retaliation? He makes Five Nights at Freddy's 4, and completely scares the piss out of me and many others who dare play it. In my opinion, Five Nights at Freddy's 4 is the scariest game of the entire series. We play from the perspective of a young boy who is terrorized by his older brother wearing a foxy mask. These nightmare variants of the original cast are the child's perception of these animatronics, and Nightmare is a perfect description. These are my second favorite depictions of the animatronics, behind the original cast, because they're horrifying. But I do like the original cast designs better, and I'll tell you why. The Nightmare variations have this design that purposely screams, "this is supposed to scare you," whereas the original cast design has this blurred threshold between uncanny eeriness, yet a friendly tone if put in the right light. Like, I can see these guys being loved by children during the day, but the horror that they hide is much more disturbing in my opinion than the outright obviousness in the Nightmare versions. Regardless, they're still pretty good, and FNAF 4 does a great job of manifesting childlike imagination into horrific gameplay. Peering into the darkness, peeking from behind the door is a classic move by most kids scared of the dark. The other games in the series focus on public places, mainly restaurants, but in Five Nights at Freddy's 4, it's a home. The ambiance is that of dogs barking in the distance and a grandfather clock ticking away at the end of the hallway. Normally your home is a safe place, but what happens when it becomes compromised? What happens when it's infested by the one thing you are most afraid of? It becomes a battlefield of nightmares, and I think this is a wonderful take on twisting what's known into the unknown. What really emphasizes the horror of this installment is when combined with the gameplay. There are no cameras here, it's just your bed, two doors, and the closet in front of you. Here's what an average night will look like. When you run up to a door, you're greeted by a pitch black hallway. You have to use your flashlight to clear it, or if you hear any breathing from Bonnie or Chica, you have to close the door, wait for them to shuffle away, and then check with your flashlight again to verify. And I learned this the hard way, the breathing isn't like our breathing. It's more like someone eating a microphone.
ASMR.
It's also really low, which is such a sadistic move, Scott. I had to turn the volume up higher than normal because on top of the low game audio, my parents were downstairs talking like they're 500 feet away from each other. We're Egyptian, so naturally we're very loud. Every jump scare was a kickstart to my heart, and honestly, I both loved and hated it. Besides the doors, periodically checking on the bed behind you is a must to get rid of the mini Freddys. Lastly, on the later nights, Foxy will enter your closet. Periodically check on him to make sure he stays there. Flash your light, close the closet, and wait until he's a cute little plushie again. Overall, this game is intense. I was sweating waterfalls on my first playthrough. You can't make a mistake because there's no build-up. Either there's nobody down the hallway or they're at the door, and if you guess wrong, you get to admire the title screen again. In the previous games, you'll be able to track the animatronics, but in FNAF 4, the only time you'll see them, besides Foxy, is when you die. They'll peer around the corner from time to time, but it's just for, dramatic effect. What's really dramatic, though, is the difference between Night 4 and Night 5. Normally, Night 5 is the most difficult version of the other nights, but in FNAF 4, all the animatronics are replaced by Golden Freddy. He is an aggressive animatronic that will appear constantly throughout the night. It is an intense rush to reach him before he reaches you. Using your audio to hear his laughter, trying to pinpoint his location, and using the flashlight to subdue him is heart-racing. Not to mention in Night 7, there's Nightmare, and the way it works is the first half of the night, it's like normal, night 1 through 4. But halfway through, Nightmare will appear, and he's like Golden Freddy, but even more aggressive. It is a real sweat inducer, by far the most tense out of the games we've discussed thus far. And lore-wise, this game does the series justice. At the end of each night, you get another piece of the story until eventually it leads to the Bite of 87. It creates more clarity on previously established lore and opens up more questions for those curious. Not to mention each night there's a fun little red light green light game with plush Springtrap, which you can shave off 2 hours of the next night if you win. Although, I will say, this game is not perfect. While the audio-based gameplay creates a more horrific experience, not seeing the animatronics for most or the whole night is quite boring. And the game's a little bit longer than the first couple of games, about 3 hours in length, yet it has less valued gameplay loops. I was done around the 2/3 mark, I just kinda wanted to move on. But overall, this is a very good FNAF game. It is horrifying, adds a nice twist to the original gameplay formula, but it does lose some steam near the end. I'm gonna give Five Nights at Freddy's 4 a solid 8.5 on the grading scale. This puts it in second place, right behind FNAF 1 and ahead of Five Nights at Freddy's 2. Yeah, welcome to the oddball of the series. Most have at least one. FNAF World is the black sheep. Even Scott regrets making this game. What he regrets even more is making the lore canon. And yeah, I don't like that either, honestly, because now I have to talk about this game. It's not unusual, though. You can't have a good series without making a few mistakes along the way. Some of those taking the form of, an entire game. Scott was so hard on himself, and due to all the mixed feedback, he pulled the hook on World, removing it from Steam entirely and refunding those all who bought it. Which means I had to find it somewhere else to play it. With all the mixed feedback, my personal view is that this game has a certain charm to be noted, but it does struggle a lot to capture what made FNAF good, or even what makes a good game. Scott tried something different, and that's to be respected, okay? But this is not my cup of, really anything. FNAF World begins with selecting your party. It's actually a turn-based RPG where you find and unlock more iconic characters, or not so iconic characters, the further you venture into the game. I love that even the different variations have their own characters, movesets, and stats. It's a lot of fun to customize your party and finding the best moves for progression. Unscrew is my favorite move. It's like a sheer cold from Pokemon. It's a one-hit KO, and it's really good for beating new characters. There are multiple vendors around the map that sell bites, which are like little companions that have their own effects during battle. There are also chips you can find which act as permanent upgrades for your party. They range from damage or defense buffs, random meteors that fall, or a higher chance to find new characters. If you've noticed, this game has very similar graphics to Chipper Boy and Father's Company, Lumber, whatever it's called. Definitely does not add to the horror factor, because this is not a scary game. I've had flaming hot Doritos that caused more of a reaction than this game. It more so has like weird moments. As a matter of fact, if I can be blunt here, I don't like this art style at all. It reminds me of those old computer games with like the porn ads on the side. It was a strange time in my life. So yeah, graphically speaking, it sucks. But the way you progress the story is somehow even worse. You do so by finding glitches in the Matrix and traveling through them to access new areas. You mean I have to travel around every corner of the world to find this one spot where I can progress? Especially this part. Dude, I had to ram my character into this green tent for a couple of seconds before the next area revealed itself. I have to ask, how in the world would I've ever found this out on my own? I've ran into that green tent numerous times before, but I had no idea that I had to make out with it. It's ridiculous. I wanted to play Five Nights at Freddy's so I can have a fun, spooky time, not get lost in this glitchy mess, which, by the way, it kind of hurts my eyes. I don't know if any of you guys have a similar experience, but like, I think I need glasses now. It's not fun to look at. Although I will say, after a game like Five Nights at Freddy's 4, it was nice to play a game with no jump scares. I played each game right after the other, and I felt like I could breathe once World was next. When it comes to the lore, like other RPGs, you have to do specific events in order to unlock hidden story elements. To be honest, I didn't care that much. So I don't have any footage for it, but I had to look it up because, I have to do my research. So I do know what's going on. It was different, and I did enjoy the gameplay, but as a small piece in the entire series, it definitely leaves a stain. Everything that makes Five Nights at Freddy's good, this game simply does not have. Five Nights at Freddy's 3 may be bad in comparison to the other games, but when compared to this one, it is a 10 out of 10 masterpiece godsend. FNAF World just didn't feel like a FNAF game. It doesn't feel like a good game at all. But you know what? At least it was free. With that being said, I'm gonna give it a 2. This places it below Five Nights at Freddy's 3, at the bottom of the list. Five Nights at Freddy's sister location. FNAF 1 through 4 follows the original gameplay loop quite strictly, even with their own unique mechanics. Now, Sister Location stretches it even more by giving unique objectives each night. The game begins inside an elevator where you're greeted by the AI announcer guy, Hand Unit, welcoming you to your new job. As with all Night 1s, the goal is to simply understand your surroundings and find what noses make what sounds. Night 2 introduces one of the first friendly animatronics, Baby, that actually protects you from the others. You hide underneath a desk while they claw slowly at your barrier before disappearing. She even gives you advice on how to go through Bellora's area, the complete opposite of what Hand Unit says, but it works. As the maintenance guy, your job tonight is to manually reboot the systems within Funtime Freddy's auditorium. He'll periodically move as you cause a disturbance, but simply playing the audio clips will help soothe his demeanor. It becomes a simple balancing act between rebooting and watching Freddy. Night 3 is one of my favorite nights. Going through his area involves a flashing camera where you use said flash to indicate Foxy's position and move slowly to the other side. When you reach Freddy, you must press specific buttons to fix him, I guess, but one of them is on his Bonnie puppet that decides to play hide and seek. It is a bit difficult at times. I didn't really like it, but like most hide and seek games, pretending you don't see him usually works. As you walk through Funtime Foxy's area again, you'll be captured and forced to stay overnight. Now, Night 4 is quite a doozy. It is infamous for being ridiculously hard, and it involves these min-arenas. In order to protect you, Baby puts you inside this old-fashioned spring-locked suit. You have limited vision, but of course a perfect front row seat to Bellora being scooped, which is their version of being killed basically. This is when the Night's challenge begins. There are 10 spring locks that you must click and hold to prevent from unwinding all the way. If you thought balancing 10 spring locks was difficult, mini arenas will start climbing the suit, and you have to shake them off using A or D on the keyboard. However, with each shake, the locks become more loose, thus losing precious seconds. And with each min-arena that enters your suit, the locks will wind down faster. For 3 real-time minutes, you have to endure balancing the locks, the little turds entering the suit, and the urge to scratch the skin off my face. This was by a mile the most difficult task in the entire Five Nights at Freddy series. What's crazy to me is that when I played this, I played it after the patch. It was on October 8th, 2016 when Scott decided to make Night 4 more manageable by making the min-arenas easier to shake off. To those who beat Night 4 before this patch, please leave a comment, you deserve some recognition. After an insanely difficult challenge, Night 5 was barely noted on my playthrough. Baby herself is about to be scooped, but before she is, we take out her not safe for work furry card to retain the good that she has. This involves a quick succession of putting the right passcode in before Bellora finds you. I failed a lot. Once you successfully enter the right numbers fast enough, her chip will pop out and she'll be removed. She then guides you to the scooping room where you actually die. I definitely had my issues with sister location, and we'll talk about that, but the realization that you're being lied to this whole time is quite disturbing. The real mastermind behind this is Anard, this animatronic at the window. He wants to leave this place, so he uses Baby's voice box to trick us, and then uses the scooping process to fit inside your skin. Sister Location actually does a great job of revealing more of the main story. William Afton, otherwise known as Springtrap, is a key character in this franchise, and his story is shown more in this installment with Baby. I think it changes up some things in the story in a good way. And again, I'm not going to go into detail, but Sister Location is very strong in the lore category. However, what it lacks is in the gameplay. I do like the concept of Sister Location, but it's like a puzzle. Once you've figured it out, it really has no replay value. I do like the concept of Sister Location, but what I mentioned earlier is one of my main quibbles. Let me reverse gears back to Five Nights at Freddy's 1. What I didn't really talk about beforehand was the phone guy. At the start of each night, phone guy rings with a new message for us. This is kind of like the game's tutorial, but also its source of vital information, like the Bite of 87. As he talks, you're free to explore your surroundings, or boop Freddy's nose, or waste power, whatever really. Now, in Sister Location, Hand Unit is our phone guy. But instead of being this clever source of information that's given to us without restrictions, we're forced to sit there until he's done explaining your duties for the night. There's no sense of mysteriousness, no interesting details. He's just kind of there to mansplain. This takes up more time than it should in the overall game. Additionally, and this is important to me, is the structure of Sister Location. Each night has a different set of duties that do not have any tension comparable to the other games in the series, with the exception of Night 4. The other nights harbor linear tasks that feel more like mini-games than an actual cohesive experience. Once you die once or twice, you kinda get the idea, and from then on it's easy. It's not about surviving the entire night like in other games, it's about completing a certain task and then going home to your stupid rom-com. Because the nights have such a strict routine, there is rarely any horror to the experience. Besides the potential jump scares, of course. But besides that, there's no build-up, there's no reason to make you feel scared, no tension to get your heart racing. Even with Night 4, I was more so anxious about redoing the whole night rather than the horror elements of that scene. Which, by the way, if you do fail that night, Baby will restart her little speech before opening the suit, and that's just a hit to the jaw, man. Like, on the most difficult night in the entire game, every time you fail, you have to listen to her talk for about 30 seconds before you begin another attempt. For each game thus far, I've given a title. FNAF 2 is the most difficult, FNAF 4 is the scariest. Sister Location to me is the funniest one, because there are really some funny moments. During the elevator scenes, the Dracula Romedy is actually kind of amusing, but I think my favorite part was Hand Unit's jump scare in Bellora's Arena.
It seems you are taking a long time. Please proceed as quickly and as quietly as possible.
That was an instant highlight on my first playthrough, and I think one of this game's redeeming qualities is the secret ending. See, on the final night, Baby will guide you through the darkness to the scooping room, but you can choose to be a bad boy and go a different direction. If you follow the online guide's instructions correctly, you'll find a very familiar setup. This is called the Private Room, a secret level where you fend off Anard and get to go home with your exotic butters. And you also get fired. It's a fake ending, but one that lets you relive the glory of FNAF's original formula once more. Overall, Sister Location on the scale is very high in the lore/story category, kinda bad in gameplay, and really not that good in horror. Again, I like the aesthetic here, but there's nothing of amusement here. I'll give FNAF Sister Location, though, a solid 6. This puts it right between FNAF 3 and FNAF 2. After Sister Location, I played Five Nights at Freddy's Pizzeria Simulator. And as we know here, the free games thus far aren't really doing so hot, so I had my doubts. And you know what? I have to say, as different as this game is, I really enjoyed it. It did take me a bit to like it at first, but once I got over that hump, I do think Pizzeria Simulator is one of the better games in the series. It begins with a minigame, throwing your own crafted pizza at children, an average Tuesday night. Soon the game glitches, and eventually an ad starts to play. You're this new entrepreneur trying to get your hand into the honey jar that is the Freddy Fazbear Enterprise. You start off your own pizzeria with handouts, scraping out leftovers to get this place running. You can design your restaurant with animatronics, games, hats, plates, other stuff that, restaurants have. There are also sponsorships that offer lots of green to promote their toothpaste or Raid Shadow Legends, huh? You can even test the games you put out, increasing your popularity and sometimes earning cash money. Let's talk about these for a second, because these mini games, they're something else. I bought a lemonade clown that gives me points depending on how many children I scare, but the voice lines make me think it's from another country.
Lemonade forever.
There's also basketball. Shoot 20 in a row to earn the 5,000 points jackpot, which of course I got without a problem. I was an active bench warmer during high school. I installed a Freddy Fazbear's version of Asteroids, except I'm shooting floating pizzas that also shoot pepperoni slices. Can I just say, Scott, I just love how you incorporate your own ideas into familiar ones. It's really clever. He actually takes it a step further by adding Easter eggs into these mini games that gives so much more hindsight about the overall lore. I love how Pizzeria Simulator handles its Easter eggs because they add so much value for longtime fans. These games and their Easter eggs have so many astonished moments when you finally click together what's actually going on. Also known as Five Nights at Freddy's 6, this game answers most, if not all, the important questions, and it really gives a satisfying ending to what happened to the murdered children by William Afton. Maybe it's because I'm not as invested, but it didn't strike me as much as some of you who may be watching. But I will acknowledge the lore significance of this game. That being said, there are 7 endings in total. The one I'm talking about is the completion ending. I believe that's the canon ending. There's also the bad ending, mediocre, blacklisted, bankruptcy, insanity, and the lore keeper. But all you need to know is that in the lore category, Pizzeria Simulator is one of the strongest in the series. Besides managing your restaurant, you can salvage these animatronics found in various places. The tape recorder will play sounds to entice a reaction, but in reality, they will actually never move. They only move when you lift or look down at the paper to fill the checklist. You can motivate them to behave with a controlled shock, but after 3 is when you start damaging the goods. Now, if you succeed, you earn the max amount of profit, but now, these animatronics will roam your restaurant as you try to do your daily tasks in the second part of the game. Welcome to the dream, kid. Here in this tiny office space is where you complete your day-to-day duties, ordering supplies, printing promotion, and things like that. On each side of the room is a vent, and you can kinda see where this is going. You must mandate your tasks while checking the vents to make sure the animatronics don't, kill you. There is a motion detector to highlight their position and an audio player to lure them away when necessary. Lastly, there's the silent ventilation option that helps with keeping the office cool. If it gets too hot, about 120 degrees, you pass out. Now this is the part where I usually tell you my strategy, except I don't have one. I'm not gonna lie to you. I have no idea really how this game works. I tried to make sense of it and I had to look up a couple of guides to really understand it, but all of what I just said makes sense, but the animatronics movements say otherwise. It's kinda difficult. You can easily choose not to accept any of the salvaged animatronics, making each night significantly easier, but you lose a chance at some good money. What I usually do is I play audio on one side of the area, start a task, and look in the opposite vent, rinse and repeat. You can purchase equipment too to make things go faster and also a lot quieter. Oh yeah, and that's another thing. The ventilation makes a ton of noise, so when you hear them in the vents, you have to turn off your AC and wait for them to move away. Noise is a crucial component here, so you have to be as quiet as possible. But remember all those sponsorship offers you accepted because you're greedy? Well, they'll play at random, making a lot of noise throughout the night, forcing you to stare at your mistakes until you can skip them. It's literally like those 5-second ads on YouTube, much like the one that's gonna play right now. That probably didn't work. Anyways, as a package, I love Pizzeria Simulator. The best part is that I didn't spend a single penny on this game. But what's really important for a lore-heavy series is to have a strong start with a satisfying conclusion. Five Nights at Freddy's 1 was the hook. Everybody was intrigued by the bits of story we were fed and wanted more. FNAF 6 brought it home in the end, again answering all the important questions. Gameplay-wise, I think it's good. Much like Sister Location, it did something different, but still had that FNAF tone to it by having these nightly sections. While it doesn't follow the superior original formula, it was still very tense. Every time I heard someone in the vents, I immediately shut down my whole setup and just accepted my fate. You'd think no cameras would be a negative, but because of the motion detector, you get some insight on their position in a different way. There is also the audio mechanics similar to FNAF 3, but it has more of a role than simply luring them away. Atmospheric-wise, it does struggle a bit because there's no world building beyond the office and your restaurant. The restaurant part is, in my mind, the free part of the game really standing out. I don't know if you get my drift, but it just kind of turns me off to the whole aesthetic. The office is good though. It's claustrophobic, as well as the pitch black vents staring you down from each side. It's pretty good. There is some new additions, but still has that classic FNAF feel to it. Overall, I'm giving the Five Nights at Freddy's Pizzeria Simulator a solid 8, placing it between FNAF 2 and FNAF 4. Lastly, the final game in the series, we have Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach. Now, Security Breach is a completely different game from the rest. It features more modern horror game tropes that play well with the overall theme. Instantly, I fell in love with the atmosphere of this game. Security Breach has an amazing vaporwave retro aesthetic that reminds me of early arcades. It perfectly captures what an 80s themed mall would look like, where Freddy and the gang are the main characters. The gang looks a bit different this time around though. Let me introduce to you Glam Rock Freddy, Glam Rock Chica, Montgomery Gator, and Roxanne Wolf. While their designs are not nearly as scary as in previous games, what they make up for in the horror factor is their personalities, and this is something new that I really enjoyed. Throughout the mall, the characters are slapped onto every form of media and piece of merchandise. They even have their own trash cans. There are multiple gaming centers dedicated to certain characters that dress in the attire appropriate for said games. You got Roxy's Raceway, Monty Golf, or Chica's Feeding Frenzy for example. There is not 1 inch of this mall that didn't impress me, visually speaking. Also, did I mention the Chica Mermaid? I'm sure many kids awakened their, what is it called, fursonas, when first seeing that. While the atmosphere is not nearly as scary as the other games, I love the design Security Breach has regardless. After playing through Poppy's playtime, I can draw many similarities between the two more than Security Breach's own series. And that's not a bad thing, mind you, just an interesting point. That's also not to say this game didn't get me a few times. Security Breach has a good balance of immersive scenery and sections that are dedicated to the horror. Moon Man inside the nursery was a very tense section. Without the light, the Moon Man will force you to go to sleep. Permanently. You can deactivate his bloodthirsty bedtime routine by turning on the generators. It's frightening to hear him whisper throughout the nursery, chasing you down slowly, until he glitched in place and couldn't do anything. So that kinda ruined it. Music Man's design is one of my favorites, very creepy in comparison to the others. When he awakes, he corners you in the bathroom with just enough room to escape. Shortly after, a chase sequence will commence. Those are just two of my scariest moments in Security Breach. They're fine, but in reality, they're not at all comparable to the other games. The other games had me wearing one earbud and constantly adjusting the volume. Security Breach, I was comfortable with both earbuds on and at a steady volume at 32. For me, it's a pretty accurate measure of how scary a game is or can be. I think what makes previous cast members from the other games horrific is the lack of character. They have human-like qualities, but there's a clear line between human and human-like. There's an uncanny feel to them. Freddy, Monty, Chica, and Roxy all have personalities, so it takes the edge off their horror. Not to mention their physical designs are, again like in FNAF 2, not incredibly scary. On the contrary, what this improves upon is adding more depth to the characters in Security Breach. I've noticed that each animatronic has a specific issue that reflects how they act. Chica has an eating disorder. Roxanne, as confident as she may look, struggles with insecurity. Monty has rage, as shown in his room. Freddy suffers from trauma. Losing all his friends and realizing the state the Pizzaplex is in tears away at him. I think it's great to give these characters more character rather than being these mysterious figures. I wanted to find out more about the animatronics. I wanted to figure out how they came to be in such a disheveled state. But who are we exactly? We play as Gregory, a young child who decides to stay overnight at the Pizzaplex to spend more time with his favorite animatronic, Freddy Fazbear. Hiding inside his stomach, Freddy notices Gregory, releasing him and telling him that the Pizzaplex is not safe at night. Due to his programming, Freddy's supposed to apprehend Gregory after hours, but due to a malfunction that happened on stage, Freddy is doing the complete opposite, helping us throughout the entire night. We encounter the others in the group who are more than eager to capture us. This includes Vanessa, the overnight security guard, and Vanny, this humanoid bunny killer who we found out later is actually Vanessa. I mean, really? Vanny? Vanessa? Like, what is this, a 6th grade plot twist? You could at least choose, like, an opposite gender name like Victor or something. It's something that bothers me. Anyways, along with Freddy's help, we survive the night by venturing all around the Pizzaplex until we reach 6 a.m. We run into multiple chapters that involve being chased by the cast, surviving the daycare, and Music Man's rampage. This is the first time where I can talk about a game's level design because the other games really have no sense of mobility in this fashion. To put it simply, I love it. There's variety, there's depth, there's openness to it, and honestly, it's simply fun to venture through. Security Breach, again, has a great layout because it perfectly replicates a mall dedicated to children icons. The visual appeal is quite inspiring, actually. There is a level of detail that far exceeds the other games in this series. While the other games have hidden details that reveal hidden lore or a secret ending, Security Breach has a level of detail to help with the immersion. And the game isn't linear in its progression either. You can trail back to previous locations like the entrance or the animatronic showrooms to grab key items you didn't need previously. The different chapters have both unique layouts and unique obstacles. Right before 6 a.m., Freddy gives us a choice. We can leave or stay to uncover the truth about those missing kids, and the other horrors that have occurred here. Of course, I chose the best ending.
Ah, the kids are still missing. Poor... Does he not have a home? Oh. Oops.
This is the only game in the series with a traditional storyline that you can easily follow. Personally, I don't think it hurts the game, but the story could have been much better. My biggest gripe was Vanny, because they did nothing with her character. Could have been something really great for the series, but tripped early on in the character arc. And the other games, they never spoon-fed you the story, you had to discover it. There was a signature way of how Scott did that, and Security Breach, obviously being more linear, lost nearly all of that charm. When it comes to the horror, this game is alright. There were some spooky moments for sure, but the most horrifying moment in this game is honestly slightly below a regular night's feeling of tension in the previous games. Perhaps because of the gameplay, the other games had such a tense atmosphere where I felt like I would die at any moment. Even in Sister Location, the tone was nearly uncanny the entire time. That's not to say I didn't like the gameplay, mainly because I can move now and interact more with the game than simply point and click. Listen, I like these games, but if I had to choose one game from this series to play over and over again, it would be Security Breach, even if it's not as scary. Maybe it's because I've played so many similar games like Security Breach where you're hiding or running from a monster. You know, it's like, not only have I done this before, but I've seen it done better. The laser definitely doesn't help because it renders foes powerless pretty much. Now, again, there were some creepy moments. The endoskeletons underneath the Pizzaplex, those were unsettling, like good job there. Music Man and Moon Boy, they definitely injected good intense gameplay for my experience. But in the nearly 11 hours I played, those moments were far and few in between. That is until I got to the Ruin DLC. Considering the scope of this game, it's the first one in the series to have DLC. I played the Ruin DLC a bit after the main game, and many people agree that it's a better version of the base game. Personally, I would think it's about the same. Horror-wise, the game is much better. You play as Cassie now, a friend of Gregory's who was lured here to save him. The Pizzaplex is in complete shambles, and the once bright, mesmerizing rooms have been reduced to nothing. This is also reflected in the animatronics because this DLC takes place after the events of the base story, a few months to a year later. Each of the cast has a new disheveled design that I really like. My favorite is Monty because half his body is missing, the skin on his face is broken, it's gross. This fixes my horror issue with the game, but the new villain and gameplay are kinda to me. See, for the entire game, you have this mask that locates digital nodes that you must deactivate. You follow the lines to the glitch, fix it, and go back to the parent node to deactivate it completely. It's actually quite fun, but when paired with the Entity, the new villain for this DLC, it becomes a reoccurring annoyance. If you keep the mask on for too long, he'll show up and start a time limit before killing you. You have to take the mask off, which essentially resets the whole encounter. Time limits in a game like this are a chore, and just stop the whole pace of the game. I dislike having to rush to do these puzzles, like, why can't I have the animatronics chase me like in the base game? Funny enough, they do show up here, but they're even more scripted, meaning that they don't really cause much issues when you know how to deal with them. For the DLC, they're put on the back burner, more so being pit stop obstacles than being important key pieces to the horror or story elements. The focus is on the Entity, and without much information given to us, I don't really have a good opinion here. They don't wander or cause much chaos in the mix. You won't find the other cast members in open areas often, and if you do, their pathfinding is way more limited than in the base game. It is so easy to avoid them entirely. I had more fun playing the Monty golf game than anything in this entire DLC. And let me tell you something, I freaking hated the mini musician men. They crowded the bowling alley like roaches and would constantly block you from progressing. Now, when it comes to the lore, this game has its own standalone story, just set in the same universe. I don't mind that at all, and it does make sense. With as many games as FNAF has, there's only so much you can add to a lore-infested horror series. And it is a decent story, but what really hurts me is the way it was shown to us. See, the previous games fed us bits and pieces of important lore that helped us get the wheel rolling. We could put the pieces together as a community and find out what was going on. However, in a more modern, linear story, when there are missing elements, the game's plot feels disconnected, as if it's incomplete. Not that the story was bad, again, but it's just hard to decipher at some points and to follow. In the first few games, the story was also woven into the horror factor, making each piece that much more important. In Security Breach, because the story is simply told, it doesn't hold as much impact. Like, when you find out about the children missing at the pizzeria, it's through an Easter egg in FNAF 1. Now, you would think I would give Security Breach quite a low score because of these issues, but here's what I'm struggling with. See, as a video game, I do like Security Breach the most. You can move, you can run, you can interact beyond 3 or 4 mechanics, and the overall aesthetic is masterful. But as a Five Nights at Freddy's game, I do not think it's the best. It completely lost that indie game horror feel to it. That uncanny mystery the first few games had is really not here in the slightest. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's what I get from it. It's not a bad game, but it's just not the best FNAF game. Overall, my score and ranking is primarily based on how good a game represents its series, but I do also include my personal preference. Because it's my favorite game here in the series, but not my favorite FNAF game, I'm gonna give Security Breach an 8.3, which places it at third, between FNAF 4 and Pizzeria Simulator. When looking back on the series, Scott took plenty of risks, but what's more important is that he listened to his players. This whole series wouldn't have even existed if Scott didn't listen to the critiques on some random game he made. Five Nights at Freddy's has stuck throughout the years as one of the main indie game series that has impacted people from childhood well into their young adulthood, and I'm one of them. I was 14 when the first game released, and I'm 24 now. And to see where the series ended up was really intriguing. 10 years later, not everything has been revealed. The games are still being discussed, and there's even, I believe, a second movie coming out. I have not played a series with an assortment of games that have drastically changed, improved, or decreased in the quality of their games as much as Five Nights at Freddy's. Then again, this is the first series I am reviewing, so we'll have to wait and see. The Best Game Award easily goes to the original. You just can't beat it. It sparked the series into popularity because of its eerie atmosphere, subtle lore, and addicting gameplay. There is a tone to this game that none of the others come close to. I think the original does best in environmental storytelling and horror. As for the Worst Game Award, that goes to FNAF World, without question. Not only is it a bad Five Nights at Freddy's game, it's just a bad game in general. The lack of direction, the graphics, the content, it's just bleh. My personal favorite award goes to, obviously, Security Breach. It goes without saying, but I can move. I don't really feel like I need to explain that. And while it may not be the best FNAF game, it is the best game on this list purely because of its gameplay. After nearly a month of playing through these games, I'm giving the Five Nights at Freddy's series a 75%. My reasoning is based on three things. Number one is the impact this franchise had on the community. It's a major component that I cannot ignore. Number two is FNAF World. I just didn't like that game at all, and it really brought the score down a bit. And number three is personal preference. Five Nights at Freddy's is a great series, but it is not nearly up there in terms of my favorite. In my eyes, 75 is a respectable score, but there are plenty of other series out there that I think are loads better, even without doing a video on them yet. But of course, if you disagree, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. With that, this has been the first episode of the series saga. I am so excited to do more, and please let me know if you enjoyed it, because if you don't, I'm still gonna do it, but I just like to hear your feedback. And yeah, leave your thoughts down below, what your favorite Five Nights at Freddy's game is, what your least favorite is, and of course, if you did enjoy this video, be sure to leave a like and to subscribe for more content like this, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care everyone, and of course, stay safe.